Hello, my name is Kristin Clarke. I'm pleased to be here today to interview Julie Chavez, author of the recent book, Everyone But Myself, a Memoir, with publisher Zibby Books. Thank you, Julie, for joining us today. Why don't we get right into the questions, and I'm going to take myself off video while we do that.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
So what inspired you to write such a personal memoir your first time out of the book publishing gate?
I mean, just a little bit of foolishness, I would say. No, I think, I am a lover of books. I'm a librarian and I've loved books since I was young. So for me, I had always dreamed of writing a book, but didn't know what the story would be because I really felt that I wanted it to have some value to others and didn't at that point see myself writing fiction. So it wasn't until after this time that after the time I describe in the book, that I really felt like this could be something that could be of service to other caregivers and women. And so it was my privilege to share something personal if I felt it was going to help someone else.
Great. So much has been written about work burnout, but it seems like mom burnout is something society kind of incorrectly associates with new moms juggling with pregnancy recovery and newborn care, or maybe handling toddlers. In your situation, though, your children were older and you loved your job as an elementary school librarian when your panic attacks, anxiety, and depression appeared. So did this make it hard to admit to yourself that something was seriously wrong and that you were feeling alone in your struggle to manage it?
I think it absolutely did. And I reference this briefly in the book. There's sort of a black hole for women's healthcare. You get a lot of attention during pregnancy, some attention during the postpartum phase, more goes to the infant, obviously. And then all of a sudden, you're just sort of left with annual pediatric appointments, and maybe you're tagging along to those. So I think there's a very open swath of time where a lot is being demanded of women, especially working moms, and all moms work. Some work outside the home, some work inside the home. But we don't have a lot of language or space for people to acknowledge the heaviness that is involved in being a parent. And by heaviness, I know we talk a little bit more about the mental load and the logistics right now, but the heaviness to me is the joy of it, the privilege of it. It is just such a gift to love someone and watch them grow as a parent. But it is also tremendously heavy to carry because you do have this burden for them where you want the best for them in terms of them becoming who they're meant to be. So I think you're right. I think it does become hard. And I think also if you're an achiever, which I am, if you're a perfectionist, which I am, if you're an eldest daughter, which I also am, I think that all of those things also add to it. And then one more point I would make is that everyone becomes accustomed. Whatever the system is in your family, whatever load it is that you're carrying, people are used to you carrying that. And as you start to carry too much, no one else is really asking, hey, are you doing okay with that load? How's that going? So I think there are a lot of ways that we could change sort of the types of conversations that we have with the people that are close to us that ask, how are you doing with these things? So I think it was a mix of maybe my personality and then also just not having space or a paradigm for what that sort of burnout and then turning toward recovery would look like.
Right. In the book, you take readers through your first panic attacks and the impacts these had on you and your family before you eventually started therapy. You then onboard readers to your therapy journey, including what it honestly could and could not do to advance your recovery. Do you have any advice for other parents who might be considering therapy for the first time to address possible mother burnout or related anxiety or depression?
Yes, I do. And of course, this is non medical or sanctioned advice, but I think the thing that I have a friend recently who was talking about trying to help her daughter find a therapist. And I told her, have her think about it as adding a tool to the toolbox. You want to have support before things are critical. And so, even if you feel like you're not sure, or if you're not maybe feeling like there's a direct need to address in therapy at that moment, there's still a wisdom to having those people in your arsenal. You should have a primary care doctor before you're sick, and this is the same idea that we need support and having an established relationship with someone, especially someone who can, like I alluded to earlier, not only fact check your thoughts, but maybe have a productive conversation with you in which you can say, I feel like I'm doing too much, because that can be really hard to say to someone you love. So I think remembering that therapy is not a cure all, it's not something that is a magic sort of instant pill, but that it's also another tool to add to the how we navigate the business of being human and being parents.
I love that. One key tenet of your memoir is whether to quit your job to possibly reduce your anxiety and panic attacks. You use a variety of reasonable tactics to try to answer that question, such as talking to your primary doctor and trusted friends and family and discussing it with your therapist, etc. What do you think was most helpful in reaching your decision? Because that's a question many moms struggle with, I think.
Yes, I think I was in a privileged position to even ask that question, because I think for many parents financially, that's not something that they can even look at. And I will say for me at that point, even if it were a financial stretch or burden, I would have done anything to feel better, to feel like myself again. I think the most important thing that I did, it really was returning to therapy, because that allowed me to connect to my own voice. Because I think what's hard is that we do a lot of polling. And what I mean by that is sourcing information from people we know. And that can be very valuable. I'm going through the college process right now with our oldest son, which is, by the way, its own special hellscape of fun fest. But you do gain by asking other people, but also what you do is you absorb some of their emotion that's related to whatever that is and some of their idea around it. So when you ask someone, should I quit my job? They're giving their advice most typically based on their own experience, their thoughts about your work, their thoughts about you, their thoughts about themselves. It's very complex. So when you talk to someone who is a therapist, they are a trained observer, a trained reflector. And so they help lead you back to ultimately what is right for you, because in the end, you are the best expert on yourself. And when you're disconnected from that voice, it can feel very destabilizing. So I think, going back around, and if you don't have access to therapy, there are other tools you can do for that, journaling, having quiet time, whether that looks like exercise or just things that pull you back into your body, pull you back to yourself, and give you a little mental space to ask, what is the next step? And I think that's the other thing, is to make sure you're looking at it with small steps. I am a big make a big move and then ask questions later, and sometimes that can be really counterproductive. So if you're someone who's struggling, are there other options? Could you reduce your hours? Could you take off a day? Are there things that you can do to support yourself, as opposed to thinking of everything in an all or nothing term? And again, having someone who knows how to kind of guide you and ask those questions is beyond valuable.
And you ultimately decided not to quit your job, right?
Correct. I did not. And I'm very thankful for that, but it was pretty close there for a while. There were days that I think the only reason I didn't quit is because the principal wasn't in her office. So sometimes things roll the way they roll, but I think the more we can be slower in our decisions and thought processes, the better we'll be.
A lot of women, whether they work inside or outside of the home, will relate to your insights about just the daily stressors moms place on themselves and the society places on them to meet these often unrealistic definitions of being a quote good mother. Have you seen any of that change from when your two boys were in diapers versus when they've become teenagers?
Oh gosh, just hearing you say the word diapers makes me a little sweaty. I'm just like, oh no, I don't want to go back. Maybe with grandchildren, I'll feel differently. Um, I think there has been some of a shift, some for the better and some not so much. So my boys were born in 2007 and 2009. So the first iPhone came out in 2007. So those were so many early days. I mean, I was barely on Facebook. There were, I think the rise of social media has done some good and some bad. So I think there is a little bit more pressure sometimes for young moms to make it look a certain way. The consumer pressure is so intense in terms of you need this stroller, otherwise your baby's not going to be as successful as an adult. It's really absurd and tough to navigate, especially if you're a maximizer and you're sort of always looking for the best thing. I think that can be really stressful. So I think that rise has been there, but you are seeing more pictures of realistic motherhood, and there are many accounts devoted to that. So I think, to answer your question, it is starting, but I think so much of it comes down to the individual. There are some people that don't experience that internal pressure, and I am very happy for them. I am not one of them. So I think, again, so much comes down to understanding yourself. Social media isn't necessarily the problem for a mom, but understanding what you are taking from social media, because what might be problematic for me might not be an issue for another mother, so, or another parent. So I think, it's a tricky question. I hope that we're getting closer, and I do think there's more space for women to express what's happening, but I think societally we're not even close to having the supports that then allow that a little bit more. So I think we're in the messy middle, and I think we'll be there for a while. So that's why it's important to have that sort of connection back to what is it that I need and how do I create space for that, even the tiniest space.
I love that, the messy middle. Yeah, this led right into my next question, which is around social media, that a lot of people complaining that that's exacerbating these expectations and putting these perceived pressures to post happy family photos on Instagram or depict, perfect family lives on Facebook. Did you find for yourself, in your own therapeutic journey, that social media was kind of playing a role in developing your own assumptions and aspirations around modern motherhood? And then how did you address that?
That is an excellent question. Thankfully for me, I don't think it put a lot of pressure on me as it related to motherhood. However, for me, social media ended up playing a role because it was taking me sort of on an emotional roller coaster ride in other ways. We had a close friend who died around that time, and his wife, his widow, would post, and it was so painful for me because I was deeply afraid that something would happen to my husband or my children. And I was really living that mental journey when I would see her posts. So, again, this was something I had to address for myself, and that I had to understand that I was taking sort of this empathetic role, but I was taking it too far, and it wasn't serving me. So I think that I don't feel that pressure necessarily to emulate. I see it in other ways for sure. I mean, some of these houses on Instagram just make me want to burn mine to the ground and start again. So I know we experience the pressure in different ways. But I think I've never been as concerned about it looking perfect, but I am concerned about doing it perfectly. And that might sound like not a distinction to some people, but I think it's, again, more of that internal sort of self-directed pressure. So what I do is I'm just careful. I pay attention to how I feel. I set limits for myself in terms of social media. I have unfollowed certain accounts. I mute certain accounts. I do what I need to do to feel like social media is serving me and I am not serving social media. So that is a tricky thing. And I think also watching the mindlessness of it, it's so addictive. And being a young mother, especially with little kids, can be super boring. They're adorable and I love them and they're fun and interesting, but also one can only play Legos for so long before one wants to just, leave the house and never come back. So I think there's an element of paying attention to that as well, that it can really suck you dry without you realizing. So I have so many boring answers for self-care that really usually come back to paying attention to how you feel.
Right. Your book shares the pressures of elder care too, since your dad had heart surgeries at the same time you were in probably the worst stages of your mental health crisis. And in your case, you were also juggling international time zones and different cultural norms since your parents lived in Japan. Can you briefly talk about the role of elder care and mom burnout?
Sure. I think that is such a significant piece because, Kelly Corrigan wrote about it in The Middle Place forever ago, where she was both a daughter and a parent. And then there's also this element where, and that was when she was going through a cancer diagnosis. But I think when you're caring for the people around you that are older, it's challenging for everyone in a different way because it upsets what was the original order of things. So these were the people most often that cared for you, and now you are in a caring role. So there's that element of sort of unsettledness, and especially if they're not really wanting to be cared for. I didn't experience that, but I think you're fighting a battle on two different fronts at that point. So those pieces, it's extremely draining. I think you need to watch for yourself. Now, ours was strange because I wasn't able to be there. And so much of that stress was absorbed for me. Whereas I am very much a doer. So I think I would have been showing up and trying to help if they had been closer to me. But that too would have been its own drain. So I think no matter what, when people you love, no matter their age, are struggling and you are taking some of that on either emotionally or practically, there is space to examine what you can actually accomplish and hold. And there are also seasons. I think the other thing I want to say is that there are seasons of life that you cannot shed any responsibility from. So there are times we go through that are tremendously stressful and you just have to get it done. But then on the other side of that, looking back and seeing what you need to do to maybe restore some of those depletions that you've experienced during that season. So again, I mean, it really is so much of, what can I handle? What's realistic? How do I support these people and myself in these ways as much as I can?
Right. A key takeaway from your therapy was developing a guilt-free habit of asking yourself, what do I need? Can you explain that more, such as when to ask that question, some of the options for responses, and even how to give yourself the permission to ask it?
Absolutely. I mean, learn from my learn from my mistakes, friends, because I think that I didn't start asking myself that until I was an absolute mess and I was really hurting and in so much pain. And to anyone who's listening who's feeling that too, keep going. There is a way through to the other side, even when it feels like there's not. So that's just a reminder because I think sometimes we can talk about these ways or these situations in a way that feels very smooth and very clean and, oh, look, here I am and everything's great. But I think for me, one of the most important things that I learned is that my anxiety typically lays on top of my emotion. So when I am feeling wound up or unsure, that is my trigger or my signal, I should say, for me to check in on myself and say, okay, stop. What is it that you need? Because sometimes I need to cry because I feel sad about something, but my habit is to do more. So I try and alleviate that anxiety through productivity. And I think that's really common for a lot of us, right? I'm going to write it down on a list. I'm going to attack all these things. But sometimes there are pieces that are deeper. And so for me, anxiety is a signal to look for that. And then also when I'm feeling that sense of overwhelm, like I do not know where to start, that's another time to actually slow things down and ask, okay, what do I need to do? And that's a return to basics usually, which is, have I had enough water today? Have I had too much coffee? Have I not had enough coffee? Where am I in the day, and how are just taking the temperature of my surroundings is such a valuable piece. But I think that can be something you could start doing that first thing when you wake up and then right before you go to bed. You could start, setting a timer for yourself to look. I'm a big fan of alarms and timers because it takes me out of what I'm doing and it just says, okay, just check in. Like, how is your day going? And I think the way I think of it most is by befriending yourself. If you ran into yourself on the street and you saw that you were a little bit of a mess, it would be natural for you to say, how are you? What's happening? What do you need? So I think if you can just be a friend to yourself and talk to yourself like you would a friend, you're already halfway there.
And that leads into one of my last questions, which is around you concluding the book by saying how hard it is for women to keep themselves on the to-do list. What advice do you have for women inspired by your book who want to try to do so, but aren't sure how it's possible because they're so busy all the time? And I was thinking this when I was reading that around you read about micro joys and baby steps and such. And I wondered if that was how you started.
You led me right into that answer, Kristen. So I have to thank you for that. That was absolutely it. Small steps, small changes, those are the ones that stick. That is how you get through anything. And this book has had many lives. One of the original titles was Little by Little. That was my first title for it. So there was a quote by Stephen King in his book on writing. He wrote about getting sober and he wrote about returning to writing. And he said, little by little, I found the beat again, then I found the joy again. And that is really the heartbeat of my recovery. And I know so many people's where you you start by just doing the things that you feel like will take you closer to what you need. And then you start to build habits around them and then you start to feel your need for it. So now for me it's intuitive to check in on myself. But then that was very much something I had to think about, schedule in, be intentional about. So I think that I would encourage, you know, look around and really ask yourself what needs to be done because odds are it's not everything. Laundry is fine to wait a couple days. I mean, I was so fastidious about certain things that really were fine. So I think recognizing that you can let certain things slide and you want to if it means the expense of you and your health. So I think maybe getting honest about what you want your life to look like and starting with what you want your interior landscape to look like. And you can design from there. So I think, yeah, looking for those small pieces. And even if you sit down and read a book for 5 minutes, truly, those are things I even still do now, and it makes a difference. And one more thing I would say if you have children, making them wait is not a bad thing. And giving them time to themselves, not a bad thing. You do not owe anyone, even them, your endless availability. So if you have the means to get a babysitter, if you can call in some support from friends, it's worth it to do that.
Wonderful. My last question was, what part of the book was hardest to write? It's a very emotional, transparent book. What did you find was most difficult to write?
Thankfully, I think that it was, I wrote in a place when I felt much more healthy and stable. But I think that the hardest parts to write were probably about the pieces that didn't belong precisely to me. So when I was writing about Mondo and writing about the loss of my sister in law, I think it's very tempting. We know our own stories and we assume that we know other people's stories, but really we only know our version of their story. So I think trying to find a way through that honors the people in our life and their imperfection as much as we honor our own, I think that can be the hardest thing. Thankfully, it wasn't too triggering or emotional. In some ways, I think that was cathartic for me on the other pieces, like writing about the panic attack. But yeah, I think writing about other people's stories is something I really tried to be careful with.
Wonderful. Well, the book is again called Everyone But Myself. Yes, and we highly recommend it. Thank you, Julie, for spending time with us today and for answering the questions and kind of sharing your journey with everyone. And I'm sure it's going to hit the hearts of a lot of readers everywhere. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.